April 4, 1945, Germany. The war was almost over. The air smelled of smoke and surrender. Tanks rolled through the forests of Thuringia, their tracks grinding over broken branches and the dying echoes of a collapsing Reich. Ahead of General Patton's Third Army, a small American patrol reached the gates of a place called Ohrdruf. They expected another abandoned outpost, maybe a supply depot. What they found instead was hell on earth. The gates creaked open with a sound that would stay in their minds forever. The first thing they saw was a pair of shoes, too small for any soldier, beside a heap of bones still wearing tattered striped cloth. Then the smell hit them. It wasn't the smell of death they knew from battlefields. It was heavier, older, the stench of months of decay and suffering. The camp was silent except for the buzzing of flies. In the yard lay hundreds of bodies, some shot, some starved, their faces frozen in pain. A few men still moved, their eyes sunken, hands trembling as they tried to salute their liberators. Even the battle-hardened men of the 89th Infantry stepped back in disbelief. One soldier whispered, "My God, what is this place?" When General Patton arrived hours later, the scene shattered him. He turned away weeping, unable to speak. He ordered every man who could stand to see it for himself. Because what stood before them was not just a camp. It was proof of what humanity becomes when mercy dies. Before that April morning in 1945, Ohrdruf was just another small German town, quiet, forested, unremarkable. No one outside had heard of it, not even most of the Allied command. But behind its wooded hills hidden by barbed wire and guard towers, the Nazis had built something unspeakable. It was not a large camp, not like Auschwitz or Dachau. It was smaller, more secret, a subcamp of Buchenwald, used for slave labor and, when it became inconvenient, for death. In late 1944, as Germany's war machine began to crumble, the SS moved thousands of prisoners here, Jews, political prisoners, captured soldiers, and civilians from across Europe. They were forced to dig tunnels into the hills for Hitler's last desperate dream, underground factories for new weapons. Every day, before dawn, the prisoners were herded out for roll call. The frost bit into their bare feet, their uniforms nothing but rags. Guards with rifles watched them march toward the tunnels, where they would work until they collapsed. Those who fell behind were beaten, shot, or simply left to die in the mud. At night, the fires of the crematorium burned without rest. The smell of smoke drifted through the nearby town, but the people pretended not to notice. "It's just the factory," they told themselves. Just the war. By March 1945, the camp was overcrowded and chaotic. Food was gone, disease was spreading, and the SS had begun killing prisoners faster than they could bury them. When Allied planes bombed nearby rail lines, cutting off supplies, the camp became a graveyard waiting to be found. On April 1st, word spread through the German guards that the Americans were approaching. The SS panicked. They gathered hundreds of prisoners, forcing them to march toward Buchenwald, dozens of miles away. Many collapsed on the road, shot where they fell. Those who remained behind in Ohrdruf were either too weak to move or simply forgotten. As the Allies advanced, the guards began destroying evidence. They blew up the crematorium. They torched records. They piled bodies into open pits and doused them with lime, hoping to erase their crimes. But it was too late. The war had turned, and the truth was already on its way. When the 89th Infantry Division approached the camp, they saw strange smoke rising from the trees. It wasn't the black smoke of battle. It was gray, heavy, foul. They followed the smell through the forest until they came upon the gates. A sign read, "Ohrdruf, labor camp." But inside was no labor, only death. The first man through the gate later wrote, "I had seen men die before, but never like this." There was no sound, no movement, just bodies, stacked like wood. Everywhere they looked, they saw the machinery of extermination: whips, chains, gallows. A long table stood beside the crematorium, covered in dried blood. Prisoners had been executed there one by one. The soldiers found bones half-burned in the ovens, and carts filled with ashes waiting to be dumped. One survivor, barely able to stand, whispered that the guards had fled only a day before. "They killed everyone they could," he said. They didn't want witnesses. That night, the soldiers of General Patton's army couldn't eat. Many sat in silence, staring at the ground. Some prayed, others vomited. They had fought across Europe, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, but nothing had prepared them for this. The next morning, General Patton arrived himself. He walked through the camp slowly, his boots crunching over the gravel paths between corpses. Even the man known for his iron nerves and fiery temper broke down. He turned to his aide, his face pale, and said quietly, "I cannot look at this anymore. This is beyond war." But Patton didn't walk away entirely. He called for General Eisenhower and General Bradley to come see it with their own eyes, because he understood something profound. If the world didn't see this horror now, someday someone would deny it ever happened. So Patton ordered, "Bring every soldier who can stand. Bring the photographers. Bring the press." He was going to make sure that the truth of Ohrdruf would never be buried again. April 12, 1945. The wind cut across the barbed wire fences of Ohrdruf, carrying with it a smell that no one could forget. The camp had been liberated a week earlier, but the bodies still lay where the SS had left them. Flies moved in clouds over the open graves. A convoy of jeeps pulled up to the entrance. From one of them stepped three of the most powerful men in the Allied armies: General Dwight D. Eisenhower, General George S. Patton, and General Omar Bradley. They had come to see with their own eyes what the soldiers had been whispering about, something too awful to believe without proof. The soldiers who greeted them didn't salute. They just stood silently, faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. A young private murmured, "Sir, you should prepare yourself." Eisenhower walked forward first. Patton followed, his jaw tight. Bradley said nothing. They entered through the gates, past the guard towers and the silent barracks. Inside the yard, rows of corpses stretched as far as the eye could see. Limbs tangled, faces hollow. Some lay with arms crossed as if they'd tried to protect themselves at the last moment. Others were little more than skeletons wrapped in rags. Patton, who had led men through the blood of North Africa and the carnage of Europe, suddenly stopped. He turned away, took 2 steps, and vomited behind a shed. Eisenhower didn't move. His eyes followed every detail: the ropes, the gallows, the pits half filled with lime. He forced himself to look. Later he would write, "I wanted to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." A few survivors were brought forward, barely alive, eyes sunken deep into their skulls. One of them, trembling, saluted. "Danke," he whispered. Eisenhower nodded, but he could not speak. They were shown the crematorium, its chimney still black, the brick walls coated with ash. The stench was overwhelming. On a table nearby lay instruments the guards had used for torture. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Patton, wiping his mouth, said hoarsely, "Every American soldier should see this, so they know what they're fighting for." Eisenhower agreed. He ordered all available soldiers from nearby divisions to be brought to Ohrdruf. Thousands would arrive in the following days, marching silently through the camp, learning what evil truly looked like. But Eisenhower didn't stop there. He summoned reporters, cameramen, and even representatives from Congress. If the world was going to rebuild after this war, it had to know what had been done in its shadows. 2 days later, Eisenhower gave another order, one that would echo through history. He demanded that the German civilians from the nearby town of Gotha be brought to the camp. At first, the townspeople protested. They said they knew nothing. They said the smell was from the factory, not from people. But American soldiers marched them through the gates anyway. Hundreds of men and women from Gotha walked through the camp that afternoon. Some cried. Some turned their faces away. A few collapsed. But most simply stared in silence, confronted by the truth that had been only a few miles from their homes. The Americans made them bury the bodies, one by one. Eisenhower's intent was clear. We want them to see what their government and their army has done, and perhaps to take some measure of guilt upon themselves. After the burial, the mayor of Gotha and his wife returned home. That evening, both committed suicide. By the end of April, the horror of Ohrdruf had reached every major newspaper in America. The photographs were printed under headlines that read, "Atrocities Beyond Belief." For the first time, the Western world saw the Holocaust not as rumor, but as reality. Eisenhower's decision to document everything ensured that when the war crimes trials came, no one could deny it. He would later insist that camera crews visit every camp liberated by Allied troops, recording every body, every survivor, every scar. What began as one small camp hidden in the hills of Thuringia had become the spark that revealed the Nazi nightmare in full light. When Eisenhower left Ohrdruf, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he turned to Patton and Bradley and said, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering. I made the visit deliberately to be able to testify." As the convoy drove away, the gates of Ohrdruf swung shut again, but the world would never close its eyes to what lay inside. In the days after Eisenhower's visit, Ohrdruf became more than a battlefield, it became evidence. The cameras arrived first. Military photographers, journalists, and filmmakers carrying heavy reels and still cameras stepped into the same courtyards where the bodies still lay. Their hands shook as they adjusted focus, trying to capture what words could not describe. Corpses stacked in neat rows, an open pit filled with twisted limbs, a gallows with the rope still swaying in the wind. No need for narration. The images spoke in a silence louder than any explosion. One cameraman later wrote in his report, "We were told to film everything, not to look away, not to flinch. The general said the world would need proof someday. We didn't know what he meant then, but we do now." Those photographs, processed and distributed within days, would reach newspapers and newsreels across the Allied world. The first headlines were simple but devastating. "American troops find horror camp." Meanwhile, the soldiers who had discovered Ohrdruf struggled to process what they had seen. These were men hardened by combat, from Normandy to Bastogne, but nothing had prepared them for systematic cruelty. Private Joseph Markov, a radio operator, wrote in his diary, "I thought I had seen war. But war has rules. This was something else, organized death. I can't sleep without seeing their faces." Others described nightmares, nausea, or numbness. The medical teams who tried to help the survivors were overwhelmed. Most of the liberated prisoners were beyond saving. Many died within hours of rescue, too weak to eat, too damaged to recover. The soldiers buried them with full military honors, laying helmets over their graves. One chaplain stood among the mounds and whispered, "The Lord knows each name even if we do not." In Washington, Eisenhower's dispatches landed on President Harry Truman's desk. They were accompanied by photographs, proof beyond denial. Truman ordered them preserved for history. He understood that one day, when politics and memories faded, someone would call these images exaggerated or propaganda. He wanted to make sure there would be no question. And so, the American War Department compiled thousands of photographs and reels from Ohrdruf and other camps soon to be discovered. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The documentation became part of what would later be shown at the Nuremberg trials. When Nazi defendants were confronted with those films, even hardened men turned pale. The evidence from Ohrdruf was among the first shown to the judges. Back in Germany, Eisenhower's order to bring civilians to the camp continued for days. Each morning, more groups of townspeople arrived: factory workers, shopkeepers, students, priests. The Americans forced them to walk through the camp, to look, to smell, to understand. Some covered their faces, others fainted, and many wept openly. A few tried to deny it, insisting it was Allied propaganda staged with actors. But the sight of the survivors, living skeletons wrapped in striped uniforms, ended their words. One German woman reportedly fell to her knees and cried, "We didn't know. We didn't know." A soldier standing nearby muttered, "Now you do." That was the point. Eisenhower's strategy wasn't just about punishment, it was about memory. He knew that if people saw it once and never forgot, they might prevent it from happening again. As April turned to May, and Germany finally surrendered, the war in Europe came to a close. Yet for those who had walked through Ohrdruf, the war never truly ended. When they returned home, they carried its ghosts with them, the smell, the faces, the silence of the camp that had no sound but the wind. One officer later said, "Ohrdruf was the day I realized evil isn't something you fight with bullets. It's something you have to remember so it never grows again." Years later, when asked about the moment that defined his command, Eisenhower didn't name D-Day or the liberation of Paris. He said quietly, "Ohrdruf, because that was the day I saw what we were truly fighting against." The photographs he ordered to be taken that day became the foundation of Holocaust education worldwide. They are still shown in museums and classrooms, proof of what human beings are capable of, and of the soldiers who refused to look away. The truth of Ohrdruf didn't just change the course of the war. It changed the conscience of the world. The war was ending, but the story of Ohrdruf had just begun. By the summer of 1945, the camp itself was gone. The barracks burned, the fences dismantled, the ground flattened. But the memory refused to disappear. What the Americans had uncovered there would echo through generations. Ohrdruf became a word that haunted soldiers' letters, survivors' nightmares, and generals' speeches. For General Eisenhower, it became a mission. He made sure that what he had seen would never be buried beneath politics or denial. His reports, photographs, and sworn testimonies were archived and presented before the Nuremberg trials later that year. When the lights dimmed and the courtroom screen flickered with film from Ohrdruf, no one spoke. The defendants, men who once commanded empires, turned away from the images. Judges who had seen years of war wept in silence. The world was seeing for the first time what evil looked like when it wore a uniform and followed orders. Ohrdruf was small compared to Auschwitz or Treblinka, yet its discovery carried a unique weight. It was the first camp liberated by American forces, the moment the United States came face to face with genocide. For millions back home reading the newspapers, it shattered illusions. This was no ordinary war. It was a war for humanity's soul. In the decades that followed, many of the soldiers who had walked through the camp never spoke of it again. Some said there were no words. Others feared that no one would believe them. But as they aged, they began to tell their stories in interviews, memoirs, and testimonies recorded for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Private Harold Porter wrote in a letter to his parents, "I pray you will never have to see what I have seen today. It is beyond the reach of imagination, but I must tell it, because if we do not speak, the world will forget." Those words became the quiet anthem of an entire generation. After the war, when Germany began to rebuild, Eisenhower's orders remained clear. Every film, every photograph, every report from Ohrdruf must be preserved. He wanted the evidence to stand against the passage of time, against lies that might someday rewrite history. And he was right to worry. In later years, as conspiracy and denial tried to cloud the memory of the Holocaust, the images from Ohrdruf were brought out again, undeniable proof, captured by soldiers who had nothing to gain but the truth. Even decades later, when historians trace the roots of Holocaust remembrance, they point back to April 1945, to the day Patton's men opened those gates and let the light in. Today, Ohrdruf looks ordinary. The forests have grown back. The ground is quiet. A small memorial stone marks the site, surrounded by wild grass and the sound of wind through the trees. Visitors come and stand in silence. They read the names, they look at the photographs, and they feel the same chill that Eisenhower felt 80 years ago, the awareness that what happened here was real. Each April, survivors' families gather, lighting candles where the barracks once stood. Children who never met their grandparents whisper prayers for them. American soldiers still visit the site during tours in Germany, not as conquerors but as witnesses, because memory is not just about remembering the dead. It's about protecting the living. In the end, Ohrdruf's legacy is not only horror, it is responsibility. It is the proof that truth, when faced and recorded, can outlive lies, dictators, and time itself. The men who liberated the camp didn't just win a war, they preserved the conscience of the world. And as long as those images remain, as long as their testimonies are heard, the words carved into the memorial at Ohrdruf will remain true. Here, the world first saw the face of its own darkness and vowed never to forget. When the last of the witnesses are gone, it will be up to stories like this one, and people like you, to keep their truth alive. Because memory fades only when we stop speaking it. The gates of Ohrdruf no longer stand, but their shadow stretches through time. The soldiers who walked through them are gone now, but their voices still echo in every photograph, every diary, every trembling memory they left behind. They wanted the world to know what they saw. They wanted us to remember, because memory is not just about the past, it is a warning for the future. The horrors that lay hidden behind those barbed wires did not begin with guns. They began with silence. With people looking away, with neighbors pretending not to see. That is why General Eisenhower made his soldiers and the world look, not to punish the guilty, but to awaken the living, so that no one ever again could say, "We didn't know." Today, the images from Ohrdruf are more than history. They are mirrors. They remind us what humanity can become when hatred rules and truth is buried. And they remind us that courage is not only found on the battlefield, sometimes it's found in the act of remembering. So as you finish this story, take a moment to think of those soldiers, those victims, those who refuse to forget. If this story moved you, share it, speak it, comment their names below. Because remembrance is resistance, and silence is how it begins again.